I believe the next person on the agenda is Mike Schade.
Maggie, if you allow me to have an introduction, please.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Charles. Of course. Yes.
Next on the agenda, as you see on the agenda, is regarding the remapping task force. And Mike Schade is going to provide us with a presentation. But for the new board members, it was asked for me to give just a little background of how we got to this point. The remapping task force actually started in December 2014. It was comprised of Mike Schade and myself as co-chair, Charles Goodwin, Steve Huntington, Jeff Braff, Brian Johnson, Tim Kerner, and Janice Woodcock. We've also had many people come on and off through this 7-year process. This task force has been charged with working with the Planning Commission to update every parcel within the city, of course, but every parcel within the Center City boundaries. And to do that, we had a process that the task force met over the years, going parcel by parcel each property to decide the proper zoning classification. Then working with the Planning Commission, coming to a consensus. After that, holding a public meeting, allowing for public comment, reconvening again with the Planning Commission, and then the last steps is for the Planning Commission to put together new ordinances that, depending on the councilpersons, then presents and provides the end results of new zoning classifications. To date, we have been very successful. Through this long period of time, we have successfully remapped from Broad Street to the Schuylkill, Rodman to Spruce. Broad to Schuylkill, Rodman to Spruce. And as I mentioned, it's a long process. Where we're at right now is we're actually coming to the end, thank goodness, of this long process. And we have 2 more ordinances that need to be presented and passed by City Council. One of the ordinances, the rezoning from Spruce to JFK, 20th Street to the Schuylkill. And that's 2 councilpersons districts, Councilman Johnson and Councilman Clark. It looks like of recent months and hard work of Mike Schade and others is that the Planning Commission is going to put together a ordinance, and those classifications within that boundaries will be accomplished, knock wood. Why we're here tonight was that to bring the board members up to date is that it turned out the most difficult area we had to undertake was the commercial corridor. And the commercial corridors is Chestnut, Walnut, in between Sampson Streets. And to really do that work properly, we had Mike Schade work to get the sky plane ordinance and bulk and mass issues, which are architects, we'll dive into that, and attorneys, to rewrite what we have as an ordinance now. But to really accomplish this, we had to go, believe it or not, from the Delaware River to the Schuylkill River. And that encompassed 3 council people. So to get this commercial corridor new ordinance accomplished, of course, we had to go through all the steps we just mentioned, but we needed to work with 3 council people, Councilman Spill, Councilman Johnson, Councilman Clark. In addition, we had to get 2 civics on board also, Society Hill and Wash West. And lastly, we had to get the BIA, the Building Industry Association, to agree on these changes, which was the big hurdle to overcome. And through the hard work of Rick Rose, Mike, and Tim Kerner, and the others on the task force, it appears, I'm going to say, the stars are in line. I spoke to Joshua Harris just yesterday, And he informed me that Councilman Johnson, Clark, and Squilla are all on board. Joshua Harris informed me that they're going to allow Councilman Squilla to take the lead. And for this all to accomplish, the Planning Commission must draft new legislation. Then Councilman Squilla must present it to the Rules Committee, and that will take place hopefully either mid-February, mid-March. I think Steve Hunting can correct me, but it has to go through the Rules Committee twice. And then once it comes out, it goes to City Council. And because of councilman prerogative, it's normally rubber stamped. This presentation that Mike's going to provide to us and the negotiations took over 2 years. Now, of course, we're in the middle of pandemic, but even so, it was a lot of hard work. What Mike is going to present to us had been presented to the Board of Directors before, approved by the Board of Directors before, but since it's going to really take a monumental step in a very important area, our commercial corridor, which is the bread and butter of Philadelphia, Rick and others thought it was very important to have this presentation again before it moves forward through the legislative process.
So Charles, you're not saying, I know there's a lot of new board members, on the board, since this was originally presented, probably, I don't know if it was 2014, 7 years ago.
No, this is presented 2 years ago.
It was presented 2 years ago? Okay. Okay, great. So we're not taking a new vote or anything like that. This is just for information.
In my opinion, it's informational. I'll let Rick Rose. Rick Rose thought that maybe a vote was needed, but once Mike's finished, I really, it's my opinion as co-chair, that is informational.
Yeah, there's nothing to vote on here, Charles. Hello, everyone. I'm Mike Schade. I'm Maggie, everyone. Nice to see you all. And yes, we presented this roughly 2 years ago, December, over in Brandywine building. So it's been at least 2 years. And it was voted on then that our committee should move forward with trying to get this ordinance changed. And as Charles said, we're just about there. It's not quite there yet. For those of you that weren't there 2 years ago, I'm going to show the presentation again. And those of you who saw it, bear with me. Hopefully this is appearing on your screen. And you can hear me. So if someone would nod to that, I'll get going. Yes, you can hear me and can see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah, this was dated December 3rd, 2020, which is, I think, when we last presented it to CCRA. And I should only take 10 minutes or less to discuss, but basically, in 2012, when the zoning code was rewritten, certain things were added to the code, a lot of them great. Some of them may have missed some areas that we think are important. And this change in the ordinance that we're about to get written in restores some of those things we felt we lost. I'm not going to read through all this stuff, but basically this presentation has been given to larger groups. And I guess those of you that bothered to read it, you must have too much free time on your hands, but it's a document that assesses the types of things that we lost. We studied as our Remapping Committee did. The major points are that we have these beautiful pedestrian scaled streets, and Steve Hunting is one termed it the Rose Mojo, Rittenhouse Rose Mojo. We have these great variety of architecture, mix of high and low buildings, and very pedestrian, and as this picture shows, bike friendly as well. It includes Sansom Street, Chestnut Street, and Walnut Street. With a great selection of buildings, historic and new, that really make a great mix. However, those three streets are actually all zoned CMX5, which is the largest allowable building height and fewest setbacks for all of Center City, all of Philadelphia zoning. Similar CMX5 zones include Market Street, JFK Boulevard, excuse me, which are, as you know, pretty much automobile scaled and happen to have monotonous architecture, not a result of the zoning, but allowed by the zoning. This is a map showing the current zoning in our neighborhood, the Rittenhouse Square in the center, and these lower yellow and light red colored residential districts to the southwest. CMX4 districts in the bright red kind of runs through the diagonal, and then CMX5 essentially radiates out from City Hall, where it's the highest density both allowed and provided for by highly transit served streets and neighborhoods. And diagrammatically, it makes sense. However, these blocks here, particularly of Walnut Street from 15th to 18th and Sansom and Chestnut as well in that district, are these streets we're just looking at these great photos of. And should developers be able to capture all those buildings or buy several of them, they would have very few limits in their zoning requirements to, allow the current zoning will allow fairly large buildings there, is what I guess I'm trying to say. In addition, these areas have limited historic protection. I actually shared this map with Tim Kerner before this meeting, and his committee, as well as Jim Duffin and Arena, others have taken on the adding additional historic properties in this area outside of the Rittenhouse Fittler residential historic district. So that's a good thing. Some of these blocks of Walnut Street, Brooks Brothers Building, for instance, has recently been added to the Philadelphia Historic Register, which will add some protection. However, as of 2 years ago, that was not the case. And this is kind of a dual-pronged approach where the historic protection as well as the zoning changes are going to do a lot to kind of maintain the character of these neighborhoods. And I think I just said what's on this slide too. We did a quick study to look at, what could happen to, say, the 15 and 1600 blocks of Walnut Street. The allowable zoning would, essentially allow for buildings 12 feet tall right to the street line by right along this area, 12 stories tall, excuse me. And, we asked ourselves this question 3 years ago now, where's CCRA's Jewelers Row? What is the most risky area in our neighborhood? And we did decide that it is these blocks of the Rittenhouse Row area, Walnut, Sansom, and Chestnut Street, where we have the high CMX5 zoning and very few other protections to allow buildings to remain appropriately scaled to the neighborhood. So we made a bunch of recommendations. We've met with the Planning Commission and others to try to get this to happen. We've met with, as Charles said earlier, the BIA, and came up with a set of recommendations to effect some specific zoning changes to these areas. And this is where it gets a little technical, and you can ask me questions if anyone has them later, but essentially there are currently maximum building frontage limits in one section of the zoning code, which prevents buildings from being wider than 100 feet on corners, 60 feet in mid-block on Walnut and Chestnut Streets. If you use what's called option 2 in the zoning code, if you use option 1, which is Charles hinted at as the sky plane, that protects that with maximum building frontage limit was removed. And we have lobbied for, and I think we've gotten everyone to agree that we should put that back into the sky plane. And that will essentially prohibit buildings from being too wide on these streets without them going forward and requesting variances. Obviously, anything in the zoning code can be obtained, a variance can be obtained for, but there won't be by right buildings that are, in our opinion, too wide for these areas. In addition, we asked for a similar set of restrictions on Sansom Street. It has a separate zoning overlay, so it needed a similar but slightly different set of regulations for it. Back in 2018, the Planning Commission was very much in support of this whole concept, and they actually wrote an ordinance for it, which got kind of far. It was stopped in its track by opposition from the developers and builders associations. And that's when we basically started negotiating with them. And we came up with some, frankly, fairly modest changes that are now being pushed forward. We have the BIA's agreement, as Charles said earlier. We have all 3 council peoples as districtists meets agreeing to changing these limitations. So the very specific setbacks we had for Sansom Street were reduced slightly. The lot widths were sent to be 60 feet at intermediate lots again. So some modest changes, and essentially it's moving forward. So where we are, the Planning Commission has received our request to write an ordinance, and they're kind of sitting on their hands until the council people tell them to do that. As Charles said, we've reached out to the council people and we've reached out to the two other affected RCOs, Society Hill and Wash West, to make sure they have letters of support, which we got from them 2 years ago, but we've recently recollected their approval letters based on the modest changes to the ordinance. And another big part of that, which some of you may remember from 2 years ago, we had a larger request, a larger ask to actually kind of reduce CMX5 zoning in the main Rittenhouse Row area down to CMX4, which would lower the allowable height and area of buildings. We've basically took that off the table, and that has essentially allowed this part of the ordinance to go through. Took that off the table with the building industry as well as the planning commission, both of whom were very much opposed to that. Again, I think combined with the historic preservations buildings that are being added to the city's historic landmark list, combined with this ordinance, will be in very good shape in terms of, again, protecting our neighborhood from overdevelopment in these particular areas. And that's it. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Yeah, you want to turn off your screen?
I do.
So are there any questions for Mike? I realize this is a pretty technical, presentation. A lot of people, myself included, are not experts in sky plane ordinances and ins and outs of building width and how that impacts what's permitted. But I just want to say my own personal thanks to Mike and the whole Remapping Committee for really hustling this through there. It was, it was sort of dead in 2018, and we said, well, we got to get BIA involved, and and Mike successfully negotiated with them. I believe Janice Woodcock was also in on some of those meetings, and Rick Gross. So it's a real win for CCRA that this is moving forward. Elena, and then Ben.
Yeah, nice presentation. I appreciate it. One thing you mentioned was that there could always be zoning variances, and I'm just curious about the types of arguments or grounds that might be offered to get a variance that would upset the apple cart of all the work you've done. Would it be things like, putting in affordable housing or putting in green roofs or something like that, and then suddenly we have things going up higher or wider? Just curious about it.
Sure. Well, Elena, those two things you mentioned, affordable housing and green roofs, are actually already built into the code as bonuses. So meaning if you're, for instance, you're allowed to build a 12-story building and you agree to put a green roof on it, you might be allowed to build a 13-story building. If you agree to have some portion of it affordable housing, you might go up to 14 or 15 stories. And those things are already written into the code. We've not made any attempt to change those bonuses. The things we're changing that people might come out of variances with would be particularly the building frontage on a street. 60 feet might be narrow for some buildings. For instance, those of you that know what the Gap is on the south side of Walnut Street, or formerly the Gap, or whatever it is now, I guess it's vacant. Excuse me, when that was built, the 60-foot limit was actually, that was back in, I don't know, early 90s probably. And they obtained a variance to allow that at that time. And the things they proposed to do were to kind of break the building scale on the facade to have it broken into 3 sort of 25-foot bays as opposed to looking like one 75-foot wide building. So they got a variance to allow that. And that type of variance, I think, is probably the most likely thing to happen. People want to do a wider building than it's allowed. But I think what we'll do, what good architects will do, will break down the scale of the building either by changing planes of the building or materials or whatever to make sure that there's differentiation of scale. Other variances are hard to predict. I mean, anything can happen. Any developer wants to do something, is going to come up with something, and they're going to hire a good lawyer, and we'll have to deal with that at that time, or the zoning committee will.
Right. Ben Weinrob?
Yeah, thanks. Awesome. Very helpful. The sky issue, can you just give us an abridged definition of that one more time? I lost you on that one.
Okay. There are 2 methods to determine the height and setbacks for buildings in CMX4 and CMX5 zones, the largest commercial zoning districts. The one that was always in the code is called the bulk and mass regulations, option B. And those of you who ever studied architecture like I did remember Hugh Ferris drawings from the 1930s where buildings in Manhattan would go up and then step back at 50 feet, go up, step back at 100 feet, go up, step back at 200 feet. And our bulk and massing control has very similar requirements. So at above a certain height, the building's required to step back and have a smaller footprint, step away from the street. And it was very prescriptive, and it worked pretty well. The sky plane is another whole concept that does the same thing with a different math. You set in the middle of the street, you find out how wide the street is, and you project up a line, and you have to decide how much sky you can see around the building at any given height. So the building doesn't have to step back, but it would have to get narrower to allow you to see more sky as you get higher. So those are the two methods that determine height and bulk. And only the old-fashioned one, option B, had the maximum building frontage requirement in it. The sky plane one took that away. And it essentially would have allowed a skyscraper on the block, or still does, because it's not changed yet on any of these blocks, you know, the full 400 width of the block. So we think that was a real oversight in the code. No one really thought about it. Honestly, Tim Kerner kind of uncovered it, and we have moved from there. And hopefully we'll have it resolved in a matter of months or less. Anyone else?
Any other questions or comments for Mike?
I don't know how bridge that was, Ben, but it kept everyone else from asking questions, so that's good. Thank you for having me.
I don't see, oh, David?
Jeff Braff.
Do you have a question?
Oh,
Yeah,
Jeff, okay, sorry.
so I'm on the committee, but I thought it just might be helpful for the group that on the very first page of the presentation, it was showed that this was presented to CCRA in December of 2020. And the change, and really the only change from in the presentation, is the compromise and all the work that was done with the BIA and CCRA walking away from our negotiating position to change the zoning down, to downzone the area. But everything else, you know, the board saw before, and the change is simply working it out with the BIA to get their support, which also got the support of the Planning Commission and also got the support of the 3 council people. And we kept the support of the 3 the other RCOs.
Yes, it's a really win-win-win. Nathaniel or Parks?
You guys mentioned that you didn't bring in the folks east of Broad. Also, can you address a little bit about what happens east of Broad?
The ordinance, it's mainly because the overlays existing are for Chestnut, Walnut, and Sansom Street. And they, of course, go river to river and beyond the current existing overlays. So we're making tweaks to what can happen within those overlays. So rather than come up with a new overlay to stop at Broad Street, we went to our fellow RCOs and said, these things would help you guys too on your blocks of Walnut, Chestnut, and Sansom. And they agreed and have supported it. Does that make sense?
So basically it's the same zoning for those 3 streets, both west and east of Broad.
Correct.
Thanks.
Okay, and David?
Okay, I'm
David
unmuted.
Rose?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for all of your hard work on this. I think the compromise that has been laid out is a very savvy one. I think what it allows us to do, and this is dealing with someone who has to deal with a lot of developers on an ongoing basis, when people come over and they are requesting, you know, whatever, they're going to request the moon for, you know, whatever projects they have. These efforts allow the community to have input because you put those frontages back in there and it brings us back to the table. And the fact that they have to request a variance means that, you know, we have an opportunity to get to the table and work with the developers to come up with, you know, some better options. So I just want to say thank you for all the hard work and great job.
Well, David, I should thank you for your time on our committee because obviously you were on it for quite a long time. And although we all had quite a few disagreements, I have to say that all your points of view stuck with us and I think helped formulate all the changes that we've moved forward with. So thanks.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody on the committee for all this hard work. And Mike, and Rick and Janice, especially for getting it through the BIA. And hopefully we'll have some new zoning in place in the spring. It's great, really great.